Well, thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. I'm actually humbled to be on a program with Professors Mark Regness, Dan Bonneback, and Robert Coons. Dan, Robert, and I was part of their work earlier in this, about 10 years ago, and I know Kevin was developing a program in Western civilization that brought some of the best teachers from around the country and created courses for students to learn more about our civilization through its history. Before I go on, I also want to acknowledge my friend and former student Ryan Maksud, who assisted me in doing research for this topic. Ryan will be entering a great law school in the fall, and he will know more about the court going into law school than I knew coming out of law school. And also my new friend, or our new friend, my wife is here, Mariana Orlandi. Appreciate you inviting me. So the title of the talk is something like "A Court Like a Family, Differences in Ideologies," and so on. And it raises the question, is the court like a family? Yes and no. So we'll talk about that. And really it's about how do we surmount, surpass, overcome, get over the divide. Because it's clear for most of the life of the court, not all the judges agree with each other. It's also clear, by the way, historically, that some Chief Justices were better than others at getting full agreement. And I'll mention a little bit about that, the most famous being, of course, the first great Chief Justice, John Marshall. I have to differ a little bit with Kevin about how much of a divide there was. I have to kind of tell my friends, which I read in my class, Jefferson's Inaugural, which after one of the worst elections in 1800, where Jefferson beats Adams, Jefferson lost that in 1896, Jefferson said in his inaugural, "We are all Federalists, we're all Republicans." And then Jefferson proceeded to impeach judges, strike down the Courts Act that they just passed to get rid of all the Federalist judges, and so on. Hopefully, when Biden said what he said last week is more true than what Jefferson said. So it is divided now. I could give you the short of the talk, but it's reminiscent of when Rabbi Hillel was asked by an empress in Rome, what is the essence of the law? He said, well, okay, probably tell me on one foot. And he said, well, do not do unto others that you would not do unto yourself. Well, isn't that the answer to most important social questions, right? So I have my single answer, and that is Justices Scalia and Ginsburg on an elephant on a vacation in India. And I say, if you want to know how to conquer the divide, just get up on an elephant with somebody you don't agree with. And either, I don't know, threaten to throw them off, or elephant will knock them off. This is an amazing picture. Has gotten some play in the press with the passing of Justice Ginsburg, not with Justice Scalia, however. But we have that picture up? Mm-hmm. Okay. Ride elephants with your adversaries. Maybe that's a short answer. You got to get them. However, the problem is you got to get them to India and get them to agree to get on an elephant. That's the difficult part, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So, how do we transgress, surmount this divide? I'm not going to have an answer for you at the end. I'm only going to have some questions. We have to make some assumptions that we're all human, we're all subject to similar foibles, that some of what we know we think isn't necessarily true, and that we can learn from each other. Kind of the goal is what I call radical candor. We have that. This is something put together by actually a business professor named Kim Scott in a book of the same name. And she has two axes. One is cares, and the other one has to do with being honest. And if you can honestly care, if you can really deeply care and talk honestly, she calls that radical candor. If you can only speak honestly and have no caring, she calls that obnoxious aggression. And if you don't care, and you don't speak honestly, she calls that manipulative insincerity. And if you do care but you don't speak directly, she calls that ruinous empathy. And what we'd like to be able to do is to get to that radical candor. And the court is not a bad model for that, because if you don't agree with the person there, you can write a dissent or concurrence. And you can call them names, as some justices have, and so on. But you're still part of the same institution. But some justices do get a bad rap, and you've got to make sure you really have some feeling for who you're dealing with. When I worked with the Chief Justice, the press didn't necessarily like him. They didn't think he was very good in the area of the decisions made, and judges, some of the other justices were sniping at him. But we got to get that everybody is deeply human, and there's something good about everybody, even if we don't like a lot of other things they do. And I was, after the year I worked at the court, I went back, next year I worked at the Federal Judicial Center, and I went back to a event there, and the Chief Justice was there. We were in the west wing, the west lobby off the main hall. And I thought, now I can actually tell the Chief Justice directly everything I think about how the system works. And, not because I had written some things that for him when I was there, and he would use them in speeches and stuff, but it was his agenda, not mine. So we were in a corner talking. I was thinking, this is my chance. Finally, I can speak to the third head of the Berger government. Well, at that moment, he didn't really want to know about my ideas. Apparently, he had hurt himself the day before giving a present of a tricycle or a bicycle to his grandkid, and he wanted to talk about that. At that moment, it struck me, even more so than I thought about how we revere these people, but they are people. And they have to interact with other people just the way we do. And they have the same foibles and aspirations. So people are, on the other hand, people differ in many ways. We all get upset about things more often than we might want to, or upset other people. But the question is, how can we allow for many of these differences to not break our ties to other humans? What is the minimum agreement or commitment we need with someone to carry on a relationship or friendship? And how is that reached? One of the good books recently that I paid attention to is Jonathan Haidt's book called The Righteous Mind. How good people differ in religion and politics. And that goes back to this experience of the Chief Justice. There is something about everyone that we are similar. So, there's the word friends, what it means to be friends. Are these justices friends? Are they social friends? Are they work friends? Are they Facebook friends? We really don't know a lot about the relationships between the justices outside the court. I've done a lot of work trying to find out. Justice Rehnquist, for instance, held a weekly, or either weekly or monthly, I can't even remember now, poker game for many years. It's almost impossible to find anything about the game. One member, maybe 15 years into it, wrote something, a scholar named Walter Burns. And then when Rehnquist passed away, Roberts became the player with Scalia. And they played with Robert Bennett, who actually represented Clinton in the Lewinsky scandal. He was a big Democrat lawyer, but they played poker, and they got along very well. So I don't know what it means when I'm going to say they're friends, but it may be they talked a lot on the court. There was nothing. We don't know if it went out fairly socially. Now, when I do or don't find friendships, we want to explain what happened. Because we're trying to figure out how to bridge the gap, right? So I've got a bunch of explanatory variables as a quantitative social science that might explain this. So one, they might agree on the worldview or commitment to something outside themselves. A lot of Catholics on the court right now. And does that make them friends? Maybe that they're friends because they don't have any choice. They're going to show up with each other at work all the time. And they know what the process is, too. Maybe that some people just have the personalities to have relationships, and that explains the relationships that exist or don't have existed on the court. 3, it may be just basic nature for people to have friends or not have friends, kind of nature versus nurture. 5, it may be that when we're going to look at some of the relationships, they just happen by chance, you know. You've had so many hundred justices, and a certain number are going to have good relationships, a certain number are going to have bad relationships, and that's just the way the dice fell, and we social scientists really can't explain it beyond that. And maybe they have a common interest, like the poker game, or opera. Maybe they're the kind of person who really wants to make friends. You know those people. They don't make a friend with anybody. And they don't let anything in their way. Or it may be the leadership of the court has created the conditions for people to be friends. So you've seen the elephant picture. That's kind of the short version. The longer version is I'm going to look at some pairs of justices who were either friends or not friends and see what we can figure out a little bit about whether that would help us bridge this gap. We also have to know that the justices are very covetous of their privacy, so there's not a lot written about who went to dinner with who went to the bar, if they even went to the bar, probably not for the optics. We do know Scalia went out to lunch a lot. Blackler probably ate once a week with his clerks in the Supreme Court cafeteria, which when I was there was not really a place most of us would go now. So I've looked into it to see what we could find. And we're going to look both at people who weren't friends and people who were. And it's interesting because the first 3 pairs I'm going to talk about are people who weren't friends. Perhaps the earliest infamous bad relationship was between Justice Louis Brandeis and Justice James McReynolds. Reynolds was a Southerner appointed to the court by Woodrow Wilson. He was a known anti-Semite and a racist, contrary to what people think about Wilson as aggressive. He was very upset when Brandeis was appointed to the court. He would walk out when Brandeis talked. He said one time he wouldn't go to any place where there were Hebrews. And he and Brandeis were also ideologically opposite. He was very conservative. Brandeis was very progressive. Brandeis wrote what's called the Brandeis Brief, which was a bunch of social statistics dealing with the plight of people working long hours. And I'm sure in the case that he brought those briefs, McReynolds thought it was stupid and voted against him. Now, why did this go on? It was so public. Was it a failure of leadership? Was it a different set of norms? Because we think if they had to work together, we wouldn't know about this. It would be covered. This does not fit our norms today. On the other hand, by the way, Holmes once said of McReynolds, who was crying at Holmes' wife's funeral, about, well, poor McReynolds, people really don't know that there's some ounce of sympathy and caring in them, the way he's seen publicly. Well, that doesn't justify anti-Semitism, racism. But certainly no one who thinks of Reynolds would think of him as have any ability to be a caring person. Didn't create much of a relationship with other justices anyhow. Even the conservatives got upset with McReynolds. So that's where we're clear that it wasn't they had a relationship, it wasn't we didn't know, we had no relationships. The next one is an interesting relationship with Justices Reed and Frankfurter. Frankfurter, born in Vienna, Harvard Law School, professor at Harvard, appointed by New Dealer along with Reed, who was also a New Deal person under Roosevelt. Roosevelt appointed them both to the court. Reed and Frankfurter become close friends. However, there was a status difference, and Frankfurter was kind of elitist. There's an article, a big long piece about the relationship called The Buddha and the Bumblebee. Obviously, Frankfurter was the Buddha, and Reed was the bumblebee. And while Frankfurter seemed to have some contempt for Reed, who didn't go to law school, but still became a great lawyer, Reed and Frankfurter were very good friends. We know that because about half the communications in the court between justices in those periods were between Frankfurter and Reed. Reed was actually always out trying to get Frankfurter to help him write, even though there was this great status difference. They probably agreed generally on ideology. We don't know anything about their relationship outside the court because Frankfurter's wife Marion was a recluse, and Reed's wife didn't like Frankfurter because she thought he kept Reed from becoming Chief Justice. But inside the court, they had the most communication. Justices Black and Jackson. This is a very famous pair because they had a huge feud. Jackson, when he was the lawyer at, he was actually a judge at the Nuremberg trials, wrote a letter to Congress excoriating Justice Black for claiming Black was biased in a particular case. And that started a huge public feud. I mean, Reed and McReynolds and Brandeis was kind of people known. This one between Jackson and Black became very public. They're both New Dealers. Initially, they're both quite liberal. And it turned out the real reason was they were vying to be the Chief Justice of the United States, which creates, competition on all of us creates some enmity at times. And it's interesting because when Rehnquist was raised from an associate justice to Chief Justice, that is a potential very serious problem for the other members of the court, since the other 8 who were there wanted to be Chief Justice. And it turned out Truman appointed someone else, but they still were angry and upset with each other for the rest of their times on the court. In that case, I attribute part of that problem to the Chief Justice, Harlan Stone. He was kind of an elite Republican who'd been on the court, left, then came back. No, that was someone else. When he got to be Chief Justice, the level of dissent on the court went way up compared to what had been historically Chief Justices tried to get people to agree. Didn't happen under Stone. And you have what I think is the worst feud between 2 justices I've ever read about. So it might be leadership. The next pair is the Minnesota Twins, Warren Berger and Harry Blackler. They knew each other from age 6 and 8. They were very friendly. Berger, in fact, probably helped Blackler get on the Supreme Court. Berger said, "I have no end of admiration for you, for your courage and for your determination and fighting spirit that has taken you to the top." Blackman said, "I do not need to tell you what your friendship and confidence have meant to me for over half a century." In Blackman's first 4 years on the court, they agreed 87% of the time. His last 4 years, they agreed 32% of the time. What happened? Well, One may be the watershed period may have been on Roe versus Wade. Blackman had been the lawyer for the Mayo Clinic, and he wrote the opinion that Berger disliked on abortion. And we could say certain issues are going to cause cleavages that can't be repaired, but we're going to find out that isn't true either. There's a whole play called Courting Harry, where they blame Berger for the split between them. That not only did he disagree with Blackman, but he sniped at him in opinions, and therefore upset this 80-year relationship. We don't know what the answer to that question is. I would hold both responsible if that relationship breaks up, because it was a very close one. Thomas and Scalia. I think we're going to play a short video about Thomas talking about Scalia.
Fine. I was thinking a lot about what I wanted to ask you in this interview, because I know you kind of loathe doing any press interviews, and that's well established. But I was thinking about your friendship with Justice Scalia, and he was also a friend of mine. Tell me about the court without him.
Well, I think the most charitable thing to say is that it's different. And I think my colleagues would agree. I mean, there's sort of a big emptiness to it. He had a way of filling up the room with his personality, his quips, his intellect, his humor. He's when he's alone or in a group, he's got to be on stage, and he was a lot of fun. It's interesting. I did not know him before I went to the court. And I got to know him, and we developed a friendship, a bond of trust.
I got to know Thomas pretty well, luckily, through a friend, and met with him almost every year or more, other year from 1992 on. A wonderful man, very different from his public persona. People saw him and Scalia as good friends and being carbon copies. The truth is they weren't. They disagreed on a number of issues. I once said to Thomas, "You are now the swing voter," and he laughed at me. He said, "Oh, that's what," I knew he was going to laugh, that's why I said it. I said, "Well, in that search and seizure case, you agreed with Scalia, and you were in the majority, and then you were on thereafter there's another search and seizure case, and you disagreed with Scalia, and you were in the majority." And one of my most favorite cases dealing with unsigned handbills, he and Scalia were on different sides because they had different versions of what the originalist opinion would have been in this case. Thomas saying, well, the framers would have liked unsigned handbills because we had Thomas Paine and everything during the Revolution. Scalia said, oh no, they wouldn't have liked it because all the states had laws against it. I'm the real originalist, and therefore we should hold this unconstitutional. Thomas was the kind of person, when he says he has a relationship with everybody, he does. When he came to the court, he was supposed to formally stop in and talk to Justice Marshall. And this was in a video that somehow the story is no longer on YouTube, in a video at Thomas talking. So he went for a 15-minute talk with Justice Marshall, and they talked for about an hour and a quarter. It sounded like they became good friends. And they asked Thomas, what did Justice Marshall say to you? And he said, Marshall said, I did my thing when I was on the court, and you've got to do what I did what I needed to do, you have to do what you needed to do. And up to that point, everybody had called Thomas the anti-Marshall. So not only showed goodwill on his side, very goodwill on the other, and perhaps could have been actually a long-term relationship. Next video. So here we have two justices who, yes, agree, but they don't totally agree, but they are good friends.
I knew Justice Scalia from our Court of Appeals days together. I knew Justice Clarence Thomas, who was also on the D.C. Circuit. But Sandra, was as close as I came to having a big sister. You know, I did have a big sister, but she died in my infancy, so I never knew her. Justice O'Connor was the most welcoming, gave me some very good advice, not only when I was a new justice, but during my first cancer bout, because Justice O'Connor had breast cancer, and she was on the bench 9 days after her cancer surgery.
Wow.
So she was very clear about what I had to do. She said, Ruth, you have your chemotherapy on a Friday. That way you'll get over it during the weekend. You can be back.
So what more can you say about a relationship like that? However, O'Connor got on the court partly because they thought she would be anti-abortion. It turned out she wasn't, although not in the same way as Ginsburg. For Ginsburg, she was very pro, totally. O'Connor was not personally pro-abortion, but she thought the law should be a certain way. So they were agreed on that. They agreed on women's rights, but they disagreed on most every other major constitutional issue, and often found themselves at odds. But there was a relationship there, and a very unique one. Scalia and Sotomayor. Again, two people, if you looked at their opinions, you can't imagine how they could get along, but I know how they got along, because I'll show you a picture. I met Justice Sotomayor last February at the court, at a court dinner. Yes, my wife and I were sitting at a table at this dinner for the Judicial Fellows, and this woman who turns out to be Justice Sotomayor walks over to us and sits down because she was going to get up and give some award. They're doing a bunch of awards here in the Great Hall. She comes back, I start talking to her and say, well, will you take a picture with me? She said, sure. So we took that picture, and while we're taking that picture, I whispered in her, you know, I don't always agree with you. And she, without batting an eyelash, looked at me, smiled, and said, yeah, but I'm always right. And I knew she could have a relationship with anybody. They just had that personality for it. So I'm not surprised that she and Scalia, who has kind of that same kind of personality, get together and are friends at the court, even though they're divided a whole lot on ideology. And the last one, of course, is the famous relationship between Scalia and Ginsburg. And the main thing there is their love of opera. But there are other things, because we saw they also go on elephants together. But how could this be with people who have such different points of view, even on this very cutting issue of abortion? It's one thing that she could say this about O'Connor, who at least supports her position on abortion and women's rights. But how can she do this with Scalia, who is totally opposite of her? That's a good question, and we'll look at some of the variables. Susan and I got to go to an opera. A friend of ours was on the opera board. She said, come and you can go to dinner with the Scalias and the Ginsburgs. And they didn't tell me I had to sit through a 3-hour Russian opera to get to this dinner. We got to the dinner, and my friend must have not done the seating because Susan got to sit with the Scalias. I had to sit, I don't have to. I sat next to Mr. Ginsburg, and I talked with him. He was a wonderful man. And I got to talk to Ginsburg. But it was this opera thing that was such important to both of them. And more important to them than it had to be than some of their differences. And I wanted to highlight a couple of their differences. One of my favorite cases is called Republican Party of Minnesota versus it is the Republican Party of Minnesota case, dealing with free speech related to judges, in which Scalia always makes some of his great comments like, everybody knows in Washington that if a judge, anybody makes a promise, they're not going to keep it. One of the arguments was about a judge promising to decide a particular way in a state case. And if you look at the opinions, the one thing you do see is that while they vehemently disagreed with each other, they did not attack each other. And in another case, which is probably the better example, I'm going to read briefly what Scalia said. Until you tell me, if you were on the other side, if you wouldn't be upset about it. He says, today the court shuts down an institution that served the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia with pride and distinction for over a century and a half. Okay, that's what you're doing. To achieve that desired result, it rejects contrary to our established practice of factual finding of the two courts below, sweeps aside the precedents of the court, and ignores the history of the people. Do you see what you're doing with our history? As to facts, it explicitly rejects the finding that there exists gender-based developmental differences supporting Virginia's restriction of adversarial method to men's institutions. Okay. And it's a precedent, it drastically revises our established standards for reviewing sex-based classifications. How would you like your friends to start telling you that stuff? Then they say, and as to history, it counts for nothing in long tradition, enduring down to the present of men's military colleges, supported by both states and the federal government. If that was enough, he goes on, much of the court's opinion is devoted to deprecating the closed-mindedness of our forebears with regard to women's education, and even with regard to the treatment of women in areas that have nothing to do with education. And it goes on. What happened here is amazing is that he sends her the dissent before she writes the opinion, shows she knows what he is going to say. And she doesn't write a direct answer to him. She writes a very nice piece, not that I necessarily agree with, on equal protection and why it is not right for the Virginia Military Institute to exclude women by having another sister school that doesn't have as rigorous an education, particularly physical education. So how did that happen? To disagree on abortion? Or disagree on women's rights? We think that it has to do with their common interest, but it can't only be that. But let's see. We have one last little short video starting with Justice Ginsburg's daughter, and then referring to an operetta done about the two of them. You may not hear the words. It's called "We're different, and in our difference we are one."
My mother looking like the Marshal and Justice Scalia looking like Baron Ox.
That's amazing. I love that.
But in the Scalia-Ginsburg opera, there's a duet, which I think was my mother's favorite of the opera, in which as the Scalia and the Ginsburg characters sing, "We are different, we are one." We are different in our views of many things, but we are one in our reverence for the Constitution.
Yes, we are different. We are one. The U.S. contradiction, the tension we adore. Separate strands unite in friction to protect our country's core. This, the strength of our nation, thus is our court's design. We are kindred. We are nine to strive for definition.
So the question is, how do we conquer, how do we cross, how do we overcome the divide we have with other people, particularly now the ideological and political divide? Well, Justices Scalia and Ginsburg can be our model, and still we don't know how this incredible relationship happened. It's most interesting when you watch videos when he died and she died and they're talked about. Nobody asked that question. What is it that really brought... Oh, they say it's opera, but I don't think that's just it. There are a lot of probably justices who've loved opera together. There's something more there. All we know is that the ideological divide between two very different people was surmounted within the context of our country, our Constitution, one of the major political institutions. How can we cross the divide in this country? I'm not sure I have a full answer. The Ginsburg-Scalia relationship shows it can be done. And perhaps from examining all these pairs of relationships, we can find out for ourselves the best possible ways we can do it in our lives by being inspired to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, we've got some time for Q&A and some questions there in the queue. So I'll just start right away with a few of those, and then maybe if we have time, I'll get to a few of my own. So Benjamin Rogers asks, considering the current membership of the court, who do you think will be the next Scalia and Ginsburg?
Oh, that's such a great question. And you know what? There will be another pair. And one of those are going to be Gorsuch and somebody else. And the reason I think it's going to be Gorsuch is, and I meant to put this in here, about a year ago a letter circulated that Gorsuch wrote to a law student. The law student wrote a letter to him and said, "What is your advice about law school?" And he was surprised that Gorsuch answered this. If you read Gorsuch's book, I'm not surprised. And Gorsuch, the first paragraph was, "Oh, thank you for writing, and I got into law school." The second one was, "Here's some tips." The third one was, and that I get moved by it actually, it was, there will be things you do and don't do, things you say and don't say. But an act of kindness will never be regretted. And Gorsuch has that in a couple of pieces he's done recently. And if that's where he comes from, I say he'll build another relationship like that somewhere. So like that. Thomas probably, the problem with Thomas is that he and Ginny don't socialize that much. In the summer they go off on their motorhome. The one thing I don't like about Thomas is he bleeds red. They are Nebraska fans throughout, you know, and I can't do anything about that.
It seems to me that at least part of what, I mean, I think it's a really valuable exercise to look back through these pairs of friendships and try to think our way through, especially how these people who disagreed so stridently, the Ginsburg-Scalia example is perhaps paramount there, nevertheless had very tight friendships. And I wonder, it seems like there'll be lots of causes for that, but one of them is those two in particular had such an obvious commitment to and love of the profession of the law. Now, they may have loved it for different reasons, but they both loved the law and loved the legal profession. And so it seems to me at least part of what might be going on, and I'll just invite you to react to this, is that there is what they shared, at least one thing they shared more than anything else was this commitment, a shared commitment to something greater than themselves. Oh. And in their case, it was the law.
I think that's true, but the same is true of a number of them. Mm-hmm. You know, but there had to be something there that she was willing to go to the opera with someone who wrote very strident opinions, some of which she wrote. And I don't know if the commitment to the law does that. Now it may be, there won't be another pair because of where we're so divided now and it's so ingrained. It may be they came through in a historical period where there was less division. One thing that's interesting is both of them, they probably were the two justices who had the highest votes for confirmation. I think his was 96-0 and hers was something like 94-2. So there was not, on either side, there was not much conflict about them going on the court. On the other hand, there was a huge conflict about Thomas, but he gets along with everybody. So that process wasn't it. I mean, I'm just going to keep saying, I don't know what it is. And it may be different for different people. And the problem is that, as we saw with Berger and Blackman and others, there are things that happen there that do separate people, unfortunately.
All right, we've got another excellent question from Ashleen Bagnulo, one of our fellows down at Texas State. She asks, you mentioned holding the justices responsible for the breakup of their relationships, and I know that can be a turn of phrase, but I wonder what responsibilities you think in relationship to other Americans that we have, particularly when we dissent from one another. And she says also, thank you for doing this. This is such an important topic to be working on and to share with us.
No, can you
Yeah, so what responsibilities do you think we have in relationship to other Americans?
Well, obviously, I think the implication is we've got to be constantly examining how we react and understanding what's going on out there. I was going to show a clip, a slide from one of Jonathan Haidt's talks about, and I kind of agree and don't agree with it. It is, the unwisdom is the world is divided up in good and equal. You want to put that up?
Okay.
Oh, no, that's okay, I'll do it too. The world is divided in good and evil, unwisdom versus the line through all of our hearts divides them. And even with McReynolds, you see, there was some good there. We have to be cognizant about that for ourselves as we look out in the world as well. The second thing is to keep asking ourselves a question. Another thing Jonathan Haidt says, and he's complaining about millennials, he says, so this generation thinks that they're a balloon and the world is filled with pins. So you also have to understand who you're talking with and try to talk to them in the best way you can. In some ways, we can't change anybody else. We're going to have to deal with how we do it. And of course, there's also the part that there's some people you can argue with, and it's fine, and some people you might as well not. I do wonder, though, and this is the question I have, given what was known about McReynolds at the time, did anybody ever talk to him? Did anybody ever actually deal with these issues with him as being inappropriate for a justice? Now, you can't do that to your friends, unfortunately. That's the issue of leadership. And what I mentioned about the Stone Court, Stone, everybody was nutty. It may well be that the leadership of Rehnquist and Roberts, they are good social leaders. And that is somewhat conducive to that. Right now, we don't have any leaders that are conducive to that. At a larger level, yeah, as best I can see, unfortunately. So I don't know how we're going to do. We've got to try to do it ourselves.
And so this is where your graph of radical candor
Yes.
comes into play.
Yeah. I mean, look, you got to be being the most caring on the graph is great. Being the most direct may or may not work all the time. That isn't don't tell a lie, but you've got to be somewhat tactful. Because what you want to do with people is say, look, you and I are the same. We have some differences. Let's talk about it. In the court, that's what they say, and the way they talk about it is they write. I mean, please, some of his opinions get anybody angry. Because he's so smart and so cute. So we have got to ultimately be responsible for trying to talk to people. We cannot we cannot. But then the other part is, for instance, in the university, who is holding these universities responsible for promoting free speech? Where is that happening? Well, we're pretty well off at the University of Texas, but when you see some things happening at other universities, who could? Well, it's probably the donors, whatever. It's not, if they're private, then you don't even have the First Amendment there. Sometimes, in some of this, I would think some of these good relationships in the court, there's some atmosphere for that right now. Even though, I am just marveled that how far apart Scalia and Ginsburg are on one of the most cutting issues of our time, which is abortion. That breaks up families here. It breaks up friendships all the time.
Question?
You probably need to repeat it, I don't
Sure.
know. But could it be that the friendship between Ginsburg and Scalia was possible because they both believed in something that people do not believe in anymore, which is there is an objective truth out there, and maybe I'm wrong. So I will argue as strongly as I can what I believe in, but you could be right. Whereas now, we're in a time and age where whatever I believe is what exists.
So I'll repeat the question just because we have mics. It is, could part of the explanation for the Scalia-Ginsburg friendship be that both believed in the truth, that there is a truth, that it isn't merely a matter of taste, and that they could each have the truth but also possibly be wrong, and so the need to listen and be open to evidence and inquiry?
I think so. I mean, that's the whole, that is your legal process. And when you get on the court, you're willing to follow it. But that's also a good advocate who can argue any side. I mean, that's the key to my teaching in my classes. Exams, you got to be able to argue both sides. But there's another part to it. And that is, we identify more with our opinions than we used to. If I have an opinion, and you have an opinion, you're not your opinion. If you're against abortion, and I'm for it, and you're against it, it doesn't invalidate me. Because I just have an opinion, and you have an opinion. If I am abortion, and you are against it, you're against me. And I think that may be how they really held it. I'm for states' rights, I'm not. Well, you're a racist. No, I'm not a racist. I just think, I have an opinion about it, and you have an opinion about the federal government. And we may both think I'm right, but I'm not going to do anything to you because either you're wrong and I'm right, or I'm right and you're wrong. It's not going to change anything. And in the court, I tell my students, look, if you think that's a good position, that's great, but it ain't the law until you get 5 votes. And you may be right, but if you don't have 5 votes, that's the outcome. Doesn't invalidate you, just you didn't get 5 votes, okay. Go on to the next issue.
No, that's, we have we've put you through quite a bit of questions here, and we'll end at a good time. I want to thank Dr. Sager for giving us this time this evening and for taking us through some of the historical friendships as well as the more recent friendships on the Supreme Court. We tend to think of the court as perennially riven, but I think one thing that has sort of crystallized in my mind is the extent to which they're able to argue strenuously their position while maintaining their relationships.
Yes, actually, it's interesting because the 3 that I use of no relationships are probably the only 3 examples that exist, because if a lot of them exist, you hear more about It's interesting. I mean, I left out the historical relationship between Marshall and Story, who were very, very, very close for other reasons. But in general, that's true.
Well, if this issue of polarization is of interest, you'll want to tune in next week. We have a seminar starting on the Great Divide. So we'll take a look at 4 of the biggest things that are currently dividing Americans one from another. And we start on Tuesday with Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort. And so this is the role that geography and mobility in the economy are playing. So we can start to see some of the structural forces at work. And what?
The lecture.
Oh yes, and also upcoming there's a lecture on climate change, because that doesn't divide people at all, right? So Dan Bonnebach will be speaking to us about that one as well. So there are those opportunities and even more. So go to the website austin-institute.org and you can sign up there. There are limited opportunities for some of these to be in person, of course, because Austin still has the 10-person max on events, but there are plenty of spaces on Zoom. So sign up, and we look forward to next week and the rest of the semester of programming, and thank you all for your time this evening as well. Good night.